at one place in your Rube Goldberg machine or your model changes, what does that mean to the other side, right? So this is how we do things like try and understand inflation or predict the economy, like
Yeah.
do search engine results. And then the last one is abductive thinking, imagining if something, and this is what an artist does, imagining if something we knew to be true wasn't or changed, how would that change my opinion? And the reason I bring up these four things, like thinking like a lawyer, thinking like an artist, thinking like a scientist, thinking like I talked about Bayesian reasoning, thinking like an economist. The reason I bring it up is that most companies, when they have trouble seeing the future or making sense of it, they're lacking one of those competencies in their leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing you can do to get better at seeing the future, to start removing some of that emotion from looking at disruption, is making sure that you're building those competencies or finding ways to access them, and then using a process. And in the book and Rogue Ways, we talk about what I call the Rogue method
Mm-hmm.
for making sense of the future, so that it's not just like my opinion versus your opinion. We actually have a baseline, a way that we're looking at, a way we're going through it. And so the Rogue method is really reality testing any projection toward tomorrow. If it starts off from the wrong baseline, the wrong reality, it's going to be wrong.
Yeah.
uh, Observing systems, figuring out how your organization operates within its larger ecosystem, it's trying to model that, generating the range of possible futures. We, most of us, went into 2020 and we said, hey, we'll do 6% better or worse next year. We didn't realize that you could do 26 times better like Zoom did, or 96% worse like AMC's theaters did,
Yeah.
right? Both had perfectly good strategy teams going into those years.
Yeah.
um, Uncoupling threats from opportunities, right? How do you make small decisions today that increase your optionality and potential moving forward, and also cut off the possibility of failure moving forward? And then how do you experiment, and how do you invest in innovation as a portfolio like you would in the stock market, right? Like you're foolish to be 100% in Tesla, right? You should certainly be looking for that upside,
Sure.
but it's also going to be highly volatile. So you want to make a broad range of investments that are balanced so that you get the right performance over time.
Right. Big or small, you need to have a disruption plan in place. And if we've got young entrepreneurs on the show listening, it's not just for the big guys. What's your pivot if disruption happens or continues to happen? And you said something else too about the ecosystem in which you're involved in. I think oftentimes, like in the alcohol business I've been in most of my life, oftentimes we're looking at what the guy's doing next to us. Maybe he's in the same category as spirit, and you're so focused on him, you don't really think about what's happening in the world that might affect you both at the same time, right? Like
Right.
being aware of that
Right.
whole ecosystem. So, I don't know, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts on those things?
Um, I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things to think about when you look at your disruption plan is not what happened last year or within your career, but what has happened. What's the range of things that have happened, and would your strategy be able to respond to those today?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I do when I work with companies is say, okay, well, yeah, there's a great plan for the next 3 years. Do you believe that the world moves faster today than it did a century ago? Cool. So let's just say that we're going to take a look at your strategy, and how effective would it be if we were in 1910, right? The decade from 1910 to 1920, or 1920 to 1930, or if that one doesn't work, 1940 to 1950. Because if you start looking at the range of futures that have already occurred, you kind of get a pretty good idea of the range of futures that can occur.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do a lot of work helping companies figure out what will change, what we know will change in the next decade. But I also do a lot of work with companies uh, looking at the range of what's possible. I think about Ukraine. On January 22nd, the business leaders of Europe met for the Davos conference, for the World Economic Forum conference. Do you know how many agenda items couple of weeks before the invasion of Ukraine were about tensions in Eastern Europe?
No
None.
idea.
None.
Wow.
None. My point is that this is the range of possible futures. And if you take a look just before World War I, on the Saturday before the war broke out on Tuesday, the reserve men's newspaper in um, in the UK, like the equivalent of the National Guard, the newspaper talked about local shooting competitions and how much better they were at shooting than the French.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the English hate the French. My point is they totally were not prepared for on Saturday for the world changing on Tuesday.
Right.
This is the thing that happens again and again and again and again. And so I like your term, what's your disruption plan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been trying to scream to as many people as I could. We see gas prices going up, and people are so hyper focused on what that means to their specific day. How much more it's going to cost them to get to work that day, or maybe their weekly driving, how many times they're going to fill up. But what's beyond that? And I think truckers fall into that phrase, start thinking about the truckers like, oh, it must cost a lot to be a trucker right now. Yeah, but that trucker's carrying your milk, which is in a reefer that's running on diesel as well, and that milk's probably going to go up to $10 a gallon. People aren't thinking 3 steps out, because what I'm saying, the obvious, they're going, wow, I didn't really think about that. It's like, how do we get that message to think beyond your own little circle? To be better in business and in this case in life, right? And be prepared.
Sure. So I wrote an art when obviously by the book, but I wrote an article in the reason in HBR called, one moment, I'll just look it up.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it because just resources for people to get out of their own little comfort zone of thinking and circle of thought.
Yeah. So the article in Harvard Business Review is called "How HP Turns Business Catastrophes to Their Advantage."
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I bring that up is there's a link to a study I did, or a video summarizing a study I did of 400 major business disruptions that happened in the 20th century. When you take a look at what's happening right now, it's profoundly similar to the types of things that happened in about 1973 in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Radical changes in monetary policy, changes, energy shocks, disrupting Europe, inflationary pressures that happened coming out of the decade. It all moves faster now, and it's all getting compressed. But these range of things have happened before. So the question is, are you ready?
Yeah. Great question, right?
Right now, like, we can talk about, like, I was the global futurist at HP. We can talk about the future. But my first question is, are you ready for the past?
Yeah, because it comes back almost every time when you look at the cycle, right? Let me ask you this, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to this, but when we look at the current climate of everything that's happening, and I know that it's cyclical, and we've seen different eras where it's been similar. Do we think that this is going to last longer, or it's going to be harsher than what we've seen, as your example, going back to the 70s, or maybe what we saw in the 80s, or even further back? What are your thoughts on the current climate and the length of that?
So there are things that are true on different scales. So we are moving into a new world, what's called a multipolar world, where you have the EU, you have China, you have Japan, increasingly India, and the United States, all vying for their place in the global power hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a thing that we've really seen happen successfully in my business career, since the late 1980s, since the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're moving into a new geopolitical environment, and that's going to shape almost everything else. The second thing that's happening is a shift in demographics. So our population in the United States, for the first time in my lifetime, and maybe in forever, is getting older.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that consumer demands are going to shift, right? As people get older, they probably buy less wine, right?
Yeah.
Like the doctor says you can't drink
Darn
like
it.
fish, you're 72. Um, you know, uh, they probably buy less fancy jeans. They probably buy less educations. They probably buy less houses. They probably buy smaller houses. My point, they probably extend the life of their cars. Um, so as the population shifts, it's going to shift consumer demands, and as a small business, the value proposition that you provide and the scale of opportunity for you where you are, right? So that's going to be a huge issue. The next piece that I think is structural is about education. So if you believe that we need to have a higher educated workforce with more of those epistemological skills that I was talking about, well, if you are in California between now and 2030, you're going to see about a 1.2 million person shortage of people with 4-year degrees.
Wow, that's no small number.
That's pretty massive. And well, if you think you're going to get that through immigration, guess what? The only major country with enough 4-year degrees by 2030 is India. And they've got, about enough to backfill California. The rest of the world's going to be competing. And so there's a structural shift in terms of how we need to think as managers about who we hire, how we train, the value of retaining those people because we spent more on training them in the future than today.
Yeah. Wow. What a great conversation. I appreciate your thought process where you're at. And if you're listening, go out and get Rogue Waves. Can you get it on Amazon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to put up your website on the show notes here, and I'll also put the title of the book. But, I think people need to be deeper thinkers and really look at the bigger picture more often, especially the entrepreneurs or people that are getting into business. So thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thanks again for having me, Jim. This is fantastic.